family or a group. And I think that that particular definition is one that is really growing. As I mentioned, like I simultaneously feel that I am grown up and then also not grown enough in a lot of ways. And I think that what is becoming more clear to me is the embracing of the term matriarch and using that as a term of endearment and also a term of a term in which Indigenous women, Navajo women, Diné women are addressing each other with that sense of respect, that sense of distinction. And so as we move forward, really thinking about, well, what does matriarchy or being a matriarch like mean to you? And in thinking about this kind of question from a larger, broader sense, what does that definition like leave out? And do you define, with the term like matriarch, like why or why not? There are moments when I'm in the room with my older aunties or with people who are the Sani, like the older ladies who are advanced in years and who have really seen and lived through not just hardships, but have seen like life in more fullness than I have, who are able to me, who have really earned like this term. And so sometimes I get shy in those moments of being like, well, I don't know that in those certain rooms, like I've like earned like that title to be in such like honored like company. And so I'm curious, and I can kind of stop sharing just a little bit, but I'm curious just like maybe from a start of a conversation, like do you, those of us who are on the call, like do you identify like with the term matriarch as a starting place? And you can drop into the chat too. I can keep an eye on the chat.
Oh, Najoni?
Yeah. I feel I share the same sentiments as you. Like I haven't earned the matriarch title, I guess. Just because, I don't feel like I have certain knowledges that I carry. That's how I feel about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that and we can continue, I can continue, but I think one of the things that becomes really exciting, Althea, do you want to chime in? I see your hand raised.
Ready?
Oh, Althea, I can't quite, you're a little choppy. Can you try again?
Yeah, when we did my daughter's wedding, I got everything together. I was like her whole wedding planner. I had all of our aunties and everybody there. And then at the reception, my auntie introduced me as a matriarch. She was like, and our matriarch of the family is Althea. We call her Muzzy. And I was like, why are you calling me a female elephant? And that's when she was like, no. Then she had to explain to me about what a matriarch is, because really, matriarch is a female elephant. So, that put a whole different thought in my mind of what it was. But, like with me, when family is up, there's always, you know, you gotta do this. Muz, get there. Muz, you're the one that has a big go take care of this. And working with strong families, that really opened up my voice, my mind, and my the way I stand and present. You know, all of us. And just like I always tell everybody, we are all ladies. You know, no matter what anybody says. Matriarchs are ladies that present themselves, are up there full of life, full of beauty, and outspoken. You know, that's, you know, how I was taught in my family. So, you know, that's my side.
Thank you, Althea. I really appreciate your perspective and just you sharing your lived experience. I think that you touched on a lot of points that I definitely like want to like weave together like as we kind of move forward. And I also know Sunshine's comment in the chat, you know, of her just noting like, I like the definition, makes me connect with my maternal clan and a matriarch clan. Absolutely. And I think that one of the things, like, I thought it was important to ask this question, especially at the beginning. Let me go back to sharing my screen, because one of the things I like to keep in mind is when we're talking about matriarch, and I personally try not to get in those moments when I'm like concerned, like, do I deserve that title? Or when I'm kind of that voice of not being maybe necessarily so confident in like my cultural learning or my skills. I also remind myself that being Dene, being an Indigenous woman, and being in that state is one of always becoming, like, we're always learning, right? And there's a film by Tracy Rector of this Northwest Coast like knowledge holder who has now since passed, Bruce Miller, but he talks about he's from the Squamish people, and he was a really well-known cedar mat like artist and like maker and weaver, and he talks about their community and their people. The English translation for their community is the Tree People, and the film is called Teachings of the Tree People. And one of the things that he says is that in this life, in this world, we were all given different knowledge, like and he's talking about the Tree People, but I think it resonates with like our Dene principles, and I'm sure other principles that other Indigenous communities have, but we were all given different knowledge. Some of us have really great skills at hunting. Some of us have really beautiful voices, or some of us who are, you know, just prolific storytellers and can just weave together the words of bringing together their imagination and different teachings, right? But the point is that everyone brings their own gifts, and the reason why everyone has different gifts is so that we would need each other. And if we weren't in a place where we didn't have different knowledge, if you, Crystal, had, you know, all of the knowledge and all of the teachings, all knowing all the ceremonies, then, you know, and if say Najone, who's on the call, and Sunshine, all these individuals, if we all had the same knowledge, there'd be no reason for us to need each other. There'd be no reason for And so when I think about matriarchy and I think about this term, is that it's, you know, we have to remind ourselves that it's an English term, but that there are other embodiments of the practices that being a matriarch is, right? And so really having to think beyond words about like what is left out of the conversation when we solely focus on the term, or we solely focus on one way of being. I think that, you know, the first point is really that matriarchy, while it comes in English, we arrive at those definitions that I shared, right? That it is about being a community, or yeah, like a community that's ruled by a woman or women, right? The second definition was the definition of like passing of like bloodline and kinship and clanship, like through a woman's like lineage, or through the mother's lineage, a matriarch's lineage. And then the last one was, you know, the status, like the stately presence, like of a native woman, well, not just native, but like of a woman, a matriarch. And so I think if we think beyond those particular definitions, is that in actuality, in a Diné perspective and an Indigenous perspective, being a matriarch, and we can, I'm sure it's safe to say that all of us, you know, we know that we come from strong women. I don't know all your individual stories of what you hold, and maybe there might be fractures with some of the women in your community, in your family, right? But even if we go as far back as Azanaglehi for Diné people, the mother of all Diné people, that she was a very strong woman. She was a very strong Asa. So we know, even if there might be fractures or breaks in your own familial history, that you come from a strong woman from strong women, because you come also from changing women. And as Indigenous people, there are many different feminine figures that exist in our creation stories that have brought us into this particular place, that we can look at through our stories and our histories of being able to move us in the direction of understanding like our lineages. And so I say that to say that as this action of moving beyond words, the practice to me of becoming a matriarchy is living in the ways of matriation and rematriation. We can't ignore the fact that colonization, structural racism, other states of oppression exist and have actually caused damage to the ways that our women are protected, are uplifted, are amplified. And that can't be ignored or underscored enough. That said, that there is such a opportunity that we all have to practice and be in that state of becoming a matriarch. Or to some, there are different t-shirts I've seen at flea markets that say like matriarch in training, like for the little kids. And I think that that's so beautiful, because to me, like, and this is like, of course, all of this presentation is my perspective, but like matriarchy, or being a matriarch, is an embodiment of beliefs, of living through our practices in ways that are in reciprocity with our community, that are ways of being in K'eh. And to me, when I say K'eh, it's not simply the relationship between clans, but it's the action and the way that we initiate our values because we are connected to each other. So it really is, what I'm referencing is really a radical kinship, and radical being from the root word of going back to the root. When we think about like the term radical, it's actually derived from a Latin term of like the root, right? So I'm mentioning when I personally speak of K'eh, I'm talking about the action of being in K'eh. The action of being a matriarch, of living in K'eh, is an embodiment, is something that we can work toward trying to fulfill. And I think we hear that in some of our encouragement to each other, that ego. It is, if it is up to you, it's up to your self-determination, right? It is up to you and your ability to move toward the goals that you have, whether that's to have a good day or to finish your studies at school. And so to me, matriarchy is similar in that it's an embodiment of our Diné principles, our embodiment of indigenous practices of relationality. To the second point, I think when we're thinking about the movement of like matriarchy, that it really it begins to negate. What can happen is it begins to negate other gender expressions. So we can, and I say this to say there are definitely challenges with regard to like male toxic masculinity, and I'm not underscoring that. I'm not trying to minimize it, but there's also a threat of even matriarchy becoming toxic, right? We've seen that becoming weaponized against each other. And also, to my third point, we also, my friend Damien Denayeja, who is just an incredible, like brilliant, like artist and thinker, they talk about that it's also about really moving toward patriarchy. How do we honor the patriarchy? And to me, what I think that what that means to me is we have to remember as Diné people that we actually have a much more fluid gender expression than we sometimes remember every day, right? That we believe inherently, and we have creation stories to back them up, that there are 4 genders, right? And so we have the Azan, the feminine woman. We have the Hastin, which is the masculine, like man. We have the Nagle, which is the feminine man, and then the Dalba, which is the masculine woman. That those are our 4 gender expressions that we know, and those aren't always acknowledged. And we can look again to the ways that our LGBTQAI plus like community members and relatives are treated, and also like left out and completely ignored and harmed by community members and non-Indigenous people too. So I think that when we're thinking about matriarchy, we have to recognize it is an English word that has to be backed up by our Indigenous, or in this case, like Diné philosophies and perspectives, so that it becomes something that is lived and not just a title that we give out to people. And so many of you like touched on that in the comments of like, there's an earned aspect to it, right? There's a lived experience that to feel comfortable in it, you feel as though you understand deeper, the ways that about your clan or your family. Sometimes we reach these places where the embodiment of being a matriarch is kind of thrust upon us, that sometimes it's a passing of an elder matriarch that really causes shifts like within a family. And sometimes it's things that are fractures, the impact of and detriments like of living in a settler colonial state, substance abuse and harm. We have many different people who are really thrust upon and thrust into that role of being a matriarch. And not just necessarily ones that really kind of pick up and go and seize it on their own. Let me just check in the chat. Yeah, thank you so much, Crystal, for sharing that film. That film just changed my life. The teachings of the Tree People. It really helped solidify in me, and I wish that I could have crossed paths with Bruce Miller, because he was such an incredible like human being, and I'm so glad that film exists. And so when we're thinking about lineages like of matriarchs, recognizing that we can pull from, as far back as the Zanaglehi to as contemporary individuals and people that like we know. One of the most profound members, like matriarchs, that has just completely and always like forever changed my life was my late Nalissa, Ruth Roessel. And so this is her on in the picture on the left. And her belief in the power of culture is something that was literally baked into like my being, that through her I understood that culture was my power, my fuel, my sacred food, and that for me to be successful I had to move in the world with my culture. And I don't know that she ever said that in those words explicitly, but that is what I come to know and understand. And it's why I do the work I do. And I know that we all have people in our lives who like just champion the carrying on of our culture. In nurturing ways, in fortifying ways, and in ways that are just so determined. It doesn't have to always be softly, but can be really firmly reminding us that these things are important, that we have to continue to seek like knowledge. Another person, thinking about just the ongoing state of affairs of like our public health system and the public health cries, and thinking about so much of our changes that we need to begin to grapple with. Like, actually, I thought a person to call into this space is the late Annie Dodge Bonica, who was really instrumental in helping to eradicate tuberculosis within our Diné community, and is somebody that really used like her understanding of our language to message and communicate, to the elders of that particular of her community and of her time, to be able to champion the need for vaccination, the need for care, the need for recognizing that in that particular moment there was a public health crisis, that there was an epidemic, and it was really important to take care of each other, and she was a literal like translator in the medical knowledge to our Diné relatives about what needed to happen and be changed to be healthier. The center picture is one of a bunch of people who I admire, who I have had the privilege in working with in many instances. But I think that sometimes, kind of to our point before, is like recognizing that as communities, as Indigenous communities, one of the facts that I continue to just mull over and chew on is that there are over half of our Indigenous communities are under the age of 30. And in some communities, that is actually over half of our communities are under the age of 18. So we have nations that are literally like growing up. And that is, of course, like not all for good reason, that we have such young populations of people, but that we have such a challenge in thinking about how do we cultivate transference of knowledge, and also just transference of leadership skills, right? Like that there's so much has changed in the way that we train leaders. So we have to think about that too. But I love this picture because it's all people I consider matriarchs, people who are at the front lines of environmental justice issues, the fight for clean water. Many of them, actually all of them, have small businesses. Some of those are creative businesses. Some are really working toward building like greater equity. Some are really working toward closing the gender wealth gap. And so really, I call in these Indigenous matriarchs, knowing that there are also so many that we all know that are from our own families who are doing really incredible things with those tenets of Janitzin, of being in appreciation of each other, of our culture, and using the tools that we have to be able to like mobilize our way forward. And so I think that that's something that's like really profound, and that we can keep in mind and like move with. And again, all of these individuals, and I'm sure ones that you are thinking about that are in your heart, are people who embody the practice of matriarch, and are not necessarily just people who are at the head of making decisions, but that are really in thinking about their role in dynamic ways. And so I think one of the things that I come back to is that this idea when we're championing matriarchy, I think there is a consciousness that we need to have, and it's not necessarily a matriarch's responsibility, but thinking about generally there's been so many disruptions in the roles that both our men and our women across our communities have experienced because of the detriments of racism, of colonization, of systemic and structural like oppression that has made it difficult for us to continue certain practices. So we can look at specific federal policies from the, excuse me, the issues of the Federal Reorganization Act, which actually shifted our leadership models, which really forced our communities to adopt leadership models that were westernized. And by doing so, really pushing to the side the ways that our leaders changed. I did research in my graduate studies around the traditional model of the Nachid, which was a system that Diné people had, which was really a representative council of 20 plus leaders that had knowledge both in complementary ways of both being like warriors in the hunting and protecting, defending of the community, but also ceremonial. And these leaders would come together and have conversations and deliberate. We know from stories from our own history, I know from stories in my family, that women were very much a part of what was the positions that men would take when those meetings occurred. We know that women were influencing the decisions of who was going to marry, of land that was going to be obtained when a marriage would happen. And that those particular, like the ownership of livestock and land, that those were things that those were assets for using a Western term that were in the decision-making power of, in this case, of Diné women. That it was a complementary system. And we can look as far back as like our creation stories to see that there are actually teachings when we think about the separation of the sexes and that particular event, that there were ways in which imbalance began to happen when we started to disrespect each other as sexes. And so we think about, and I think about like this position, and we know and see the toxicity that exists in our communities today, the ways that women are held out of discussion, the ways that men in position of power are able to make excuses and determinants of saying, well, you know, Navajo women, Diné women are not supposed to be at the forefront of being a leader in a public sense. And my grandmother, my late grandmother, Ruth Roessel, ran for chapter president for several different terms when she was alive, and she faced that criticism too. And one of her arguments or counters like to that particular critique was that in her teachings and her knowing through her dad, who was a well-known medicine person, that it was normal and okay for Diné women to assume those leadership roles. And they had to understand those leadership stories, that they had to have a cultural understanding that would support them in as they took those positions, so that it was really up to the family in the same way that we think about that preparedness of providing a leader a foundation that they could make good decisions on. And so sometimes there are different just when we think about like the American election, when people are ranked, candidates are ranked, like, oh, somebody's a good orator. Well, we have many of those same critiques when people came to understand particular individuals who assumed leadership responsibilities, that there was a way in which people would chime in and say, oh, this particular person has speaks really well and can really communicate, what decisions need to be made, and that those things really matter too. And so I share that particular story of like my grandmother, because it was something that was really important to her. Like, oh, it was a call that she had to serve her community, and facing a lot of that same critique, many of which we're hearing now as we're getting ready to have and hold a general election for Navajo Nation president. As a community, we've not elected a Diné woman like to that position, in my opinion. Unfortunately, even though we tout consistently, there's a performance of matriarchy that's like used and propped up, right? And simultaneously, we know as women that there are ways that in which policies don't support survivors of sexual assault or domestic abuse, that there are ways in which the funding, the things that are prioritized are not things that support women and families to be safe and well. And simultaneous, we see the other argument of, well, Native women, Navajo women are not knowing of how to be leaders. I don't think that that's accurate. I don't think that that's true. I know that many of you likely agree. And I think that is a false narrative that gets uplifted because of fear. We go back to our creation stories. We go back to our understandings of deeper teachings. And we know that there was fluidity of genders. We understand that there was a way of existing and living in the world that was not just patriarchal and extractive, but was something that was regenerative, that was thought of. And so I think when we're talking about how do we reignite these teachings, that it is about having conversations like this, learning about the leaders in our communities and in our history who really use cultural knowledge to amplify and address issues that matter and that are current and pressing. I think the other piece that I'll add is that when we're looking at our very, very young communities, we also have to acknowledge that over half of those communities and people are living off of our reservation because of the economic instability, like of our reservation, because of education and attainment, right? That there are multitudes of reasons. And also just, I mean, in my instance, in love, who would have thought I was going to fall in love with a Pueblo man and live in Pueblo lands? I did not anticipate that. But there are also those reasons too, right? Like when we're talking about the movement of Diné and Indigenous diaspora, which is both the willful and the forced movement of people, that extension creates many different opportunities and many different challenges. And so when we're thinking about the training and the transference of Indigenous matriarchs to come and of matriarchs who are mobilizing now, that it really is thinking from multiple perspectives, like how to create opportunities. So I'm curious, the questions that I have really like as a closing are really ones that I hope that we can continue to, whether in our own time or, you have the new moon meditation this weekend as grounding, what are the matriarchal practices you cultivate in your home and family? What does that look like? How do we also encourage, I have a child right now, or well, two, but I have a child who my eldest is my son, and then I have my daughter. And I think about the ways in which I want my son to continue to be tenderhearted. I want him to be a spirit that honors like himself in whatever, in the future, if he decides, his gender expression is his own journey, but that we are able to foster a home in which we see the value of really a fluidity, because my children are both Danette and Pueblo, of matriarchal practices with the traditional like Pueblo side, which tends to be like patriarchal. What does that look like in my home? May be very different from what it looks like in yours. And I really try to influence and instill, and have really worked toward like championing an Indigenous feminist lens, because that is much more intersectional. And I've been doing good rallying, and that my partner now also identifies like as an Indigenous feminist, and so what does that look like in your home? I think the other piece is that we can't just stop at matriarchy, that we have to also think about patriarchy, that it is about how are we amplifying and uplifting leadership. My good friend Trudy Jackson was the first trans woman to run for Navajo Nation president in our last election, which was just incredible. And Trudy is such an incredible, like just brilliant and smart like individual. And I think about the opportunities that Trudy's running like paved like for other Nagle and Delba and LGBTQAI like relatives, in seeing like that example that she made to like step into an arena that definitely has not been inclusive. And so I think about what is my role, and simultaneously, like, how are we also thinking about making our conversation about matriarchy one that is expansive, and just always kind of calling back to the fact that we really do have a rainbow of gender expression. And I use that word rainbow very deliberately, because while that is like the symbol of like our LGBTQAI relatives, in our own cultural understanding, like rainbows are our protection, right? And so we have to also understand that our most sacred people, who are currently like our most vulnerable population, are simultaneously, to me, in my mind, the future of our community. And so I hope that this inspires you all to think about like what that can look like and what that can mean, as we move forward in thinking about embodying the practices of matriarchy and moving forward like in this conversation. I have my website, my email if you have other questions, and I have two little ones, and so I go through seasons of being active on social media and seasons of really just focusing solely on them. So you can follow me on the socials at Roessel or at Grownup Navajo. I'm again just like super grateful to be with you all today. And we have a few minutes if folks have questions or thoughts or reflections. I'm here for it.
Thank you so much, Jaclyn, for bringing so much perspective to matriarchy. And, it is very complex. And I think, the word matriarchy has so much just constraints to it for Indigenous perspective. It's so much more than just women. It is uplifting our two-spirit individuals and having their voice and their perspective and influence on the community. And I think that's something that I've always, when people talk about Diné matriarchy, I always like, well, it's not just women. It's, we take a lot of consideration of the decision making of our Two-Spirit folks and what they bring to the table, and the healing that they bring as well, because we go back to our creation stories, and it's so much with everyone. It's not just men, not just women, not just Two-Spirit. It's a whole collective. So I'm really thankful that you were able to bring that. And we have Sunshine in the chat. She said the matriarch practices I cultivate are to teach about our maternal clan and staying connected to our homelands here at our home as mothers.
Thank you for sharing that. Beautiful. Does anybody else want to share? Oh, thank you, Najoni. I'm so grateful for you all. And, I encourage, if you want to reach out to me, you can Google me. I have my Gmail and my websites that are pretty great ways to connect me through the contact form. Yeah. Oh, you're so very welcome.
Yes, well, I hope with these discussions about matriarchy, I hope that it pushes a future Indigenous woman or Two-Spirit into our decision makers in Navajo council. So, the more women, the more Two-Spirit, the more diversity we see in the council chambers and our leadership in our communities. I think that's just the more balance, because right now I feel like we're very imbalanced type of situation. So I feel like this is the moment that we're able to really pivot back to our traditional ways of life, and where it's inclusive of our families. So I'm just, want to thank everyone again. If there's any other comments, Althea, Zanaba, Najoni, if you have anything else to say.
This would be so awesome to bring out to like the senior centers for grandmas to appreciate them. Maybe like on Mother's Day, because like on Mother's Day, we usually bake goods and give out cards and flowers to the grandmas at the nursing homes. So, this would be good to inspire, grandmas at like the senior centers, and let them know what they are, what they taught us and stuff like that. Because, both of my grandmas on both sides are gone. So me, myself, as a grandma of 8, I'm just trying to, relive those steps and teach them, what they taught me. And, I like this. It's really awesome.
I'm glad. I really appreciate those words of encouragement. And that's a really great idea. I think it's a perfect time to, I've been thinking about the mothers, the caregivers in my life, as we get close to Mother's Day, and doing care packages for people who just help me be a mama. And that's a beautiful call in too for me to think a little bit broader about, well, what does it look like in a little bit wider circle? I appreciate you sharing. I appreciate you sharing that those milestones of passings of matriarchs are hard, and in my words, beautiful days. We just had our 10th year that we acknowledged a couple weeks ago on the 13th of my late Nalisa Ruth. And I can only imagine how much your heart maybe hurts a little bit today, and is also grateful, I imagine, for the teachings that the matriarch that you, whose name you carry. Like, just what a tremendous gift and blessing, but also just the challenge of rising to the occasion, like of that namesake, I'm sure is also profound at times. So I'm just sending you lots of love today and hope that you have some good care and people and good company today.
As Jaclyn, you brought some healing today. It must have been in the universe for us to have this discussion. So that's so beautiful. Yes, prayers and strength to your family, Zanaba and Sunshine. It's always hard. My grandma, when she passed it never goes away. You think about it, I'm like, it's just like right there. It's like, you could feel it. It's like, it's definitely something that will always be with you. It's that change of times and passing of the torch. It's like, oh my gosh, I guess we have to fill in some big shoes and always remember what grandma said. I always walk around like, my grandma said this, and tell my girls the same thing. Is like, grandma wouldn't do that. So
yeah, there's this, I was actually just reading, I've been really curious, maybe is maybe not the right fit, but have been sitting with the idea of grief in this pandemic and thinking about like what it means to be and carry grief and to have relationship with it, because we don't talk about that. And I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I was reading this interview today. It's on NPR. Of this poet whose name I don't want to just get wrong, but it's an Asian American poet who's releasing this new book of poetry called Time is a Mother. And it's about his grappling like with his loss of his mom, but he describes it as like there are 2 days, the present day when she's not here, and then the past of when she was. And it was just this very, very poetic interview that was really like, I encourage, if you look it up, like I encourage you to read the article when you feel resourced, because it can hit a nerve. If you're fairly more tender, maybe wait on a day when you're feeling strong. But I think about that sense of what you just shared too, Crystal, of like grief, as I think particularly like of matriarchs, but really anybody, like there's a profound way of that you have to hold it. And the ways that you navigate carrying grief is its own journey too. So I'm grateful that you brought your loved ones like into this space, and there's lessons like in that too. So I'm just so appreciative of that sharing.
Yes, it's definitely a good time right before Mother's Day. It's a gentle reminder of, honoring the women and, the decision makers in your life. It's definitely a good time right now, right before May. So you have a couple of weeks to get prepared and, make that a commemoration to the people the loved ones in your life. I loved Althea's idea so much. I'm just like, oh, maybe we can do something. There's, we could quickly come up with something and to give back to the elders in our communities. They have, with the pandemic, they definitely need some more support and acknowledgement and know that they're cared for and we love them. So thank you, Althea. And thank you, Zanaba. I don't want to keep you guys too long. Najoni, thank you for being here and learning and relearning with us and sharing knowledge. Hope to see you all on Saturday again at 11 and again at 12 for our new moon meditation. So get some rest this evening and enjoy a good meal with your family. And thank you so much. Much love to everyone this evening.
Yes, take care, everyone. Bye.
Go on it. We'll see you.